Hey guys, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're peeling back the romanticized layers of sparks and slow-motion hammer swings to truly understand a life that was as brutal as it was utterly indispensable, the life of a medieval blacksmith. We're going to step into the soot-filled world of constant heat, unyielding labor, and the quiet dignity of a man who literally shaped the very world around him one strike at a time. Now, dim the lights. Find your most comfortable position. Let the hum of the fan or the distant sounds of your world gently recede and ease into the story of a life defined by fire and steel. When you conjure an image of a medieval blacksmith, what first flickers into your mind's eye? Is it perhaps a dramatic scene from a historical epic? You might picture a stoic figure bathed in the orange glow of the forge muscles, rippling under a leather apron, as a shower of golden sparks explodes outward with each perfectly timed, powerful blow of the hammer. The anvil rings with a heroic resonant clang, and the air hums with the promise of a gleaming finished blade ready for battle or noble purpose. It's an image imbued with a certain rough glamour, a kind of primal strength that seems to transcend time. The kind of person who knows their purpose, a master of their craft, standing in quiet defiance of the world's chaos. And certainly, there was an element of that mastery and purpose. However, the reality, as is so often the case with history, was considerably less cinematic and significantly more grimy. The historical blacksmith wasn't merely striking hot metal. They were wrestling with the very elements day in and day out in conditions that would make a modern factory worker weep openly into their safety goggles. Forget the dramatic slow motion. Think constant motion. Every movement, a deliberate expenditure of energy. Every breath, a careful intake of dust and fumes. The sparks. Oh, they were there, certainly. But they weren't just decorative flashes. They were a constant nagging threat. Tiny molten projectiles seeking out exposed skin, settling into hair, embedding themselves into the worn fabric of a tunic. A persistent, almost geological irritant. This wasn't a job you clocked out of wiping a bit of tasteful soot from your brow before heading to a cozy, well-lit tavern. This was a life. It permeated every fiber of your being, from the permanent scent of scorched metal on your clothes to the deep-seated ache in your bones that felt like it had taken up residence before you were even fully grown. It was dirty, yes, but not the kind of dirt that washes off easily. It was a pervasive, clinging layer of coal dust ash and the almost metallic tang of sweat that had dried and re-dried in the oppressive heat. Your skin, perpetually stained, took on the hue of the very ore you shaped. The exhaustion wasn't a temporary state. It was a fundamental condition of existence. It was the bone-deep weariness that settled in your shoulders, coiled in your back, and made your hands tremble even when they weren't grasping a hammer. Every swing, every bellows pump, every repositioning of a glowing iron bar demanded a toll cumulative and relentless. Blisters weren't a sign of a new skill learned. They were badges of honor, constant companions forming new layers over old ones, a living painful map of your daily struggles. They would rupture, heal, and reappear with predictable regularity, often torn open again by the very tools that had created them in the first place. You'd get used to a certain level of discomfort, a baseline of dull pain that hummed beneath the surface of all conscious thought. Like background music you didn't particularly enjoy but knew by heart. So as we settle deeper into this journey, let the comfortable quiet of your own space envelop you. Imagine yourself easing past the romanticized facade, stepping over the threshold of a low-slung, smoke-stained building. Feel for a moment the shift in the air, from the ambient temperature of your room to the oppressive dry heat that radiates even from the darkened forge. Listen not for the theatrical clang, but for the subtle, persistent hiss of embers, the low rumble of the bellows, and perhaps the quiet groan of someone who knows their work is never truly done. This is not a heroic tale, not a thrilling adventure. It is an immersion into the brutal, unglamorous yet utterly essential reality of a life truly lived at the heart of the medieval world. A life that from its earliest days was quite literally forged by fire. For those born into the world of the medieval blacksmith, there was no grand decision-making process, no careful weighing of career options, no earnest family discussions about future prospects. Your path wasn't chosen. It was inherited, a preordained destiny woven into the very fabric of your birth. You weren't destined for noble lineage, or for a crown, or for vast tracts of land that stretched to the horizon, nor indeed for any fancy titles or scholarly pursuits. Your inheritance was the hammer, the anvil, and the perpetual scent of wood smoke and hot metal. From the moment you were old enough to stand without tripping headfirst into the roaring fire pit, your tiny hands were expected to contribute. Even before you could properly articulate words, you would begin to understand the rhythm of the bellows, the satisfying thump-thump of the hammer, and the constant permeating heat that was simply a fact of your early existence. By the tender age of 6, you weren't just helping, you were an apprentice. Now, apprentice in the medieval sense was a rather polite term for what amounted to a tiny, perpetually soot-stained assistant with zero discernible rights and an almost infinite capacity for being yelled at. Forget your modern concepts of childhood and play. Your face from this age onward carried permanent streaks of soot etched into the lines of your skin, refusing to be scrubbed away. While other children in the village might have been chasing chickens through dusty lanes or skipping flat stones across the shallow river, your preferred toys were likely a set of small, heavy tongs, perhaps a piece of scrap metal you could pretend to hammer, and your playground. That would have been the compacted dirt floor of the forge, perpetually damp in patches from spilt quenching water right next to the furnace that pulsed with a life-altering heat, a heat you would quickly learn capable of doing far more than just cooking your dinner. It could quite easily singe off your eyebrows with an idle turn of your head. Your games were less about imagination and more about endurance. You might play Guess How Hot This Is with your hand, spoiler alert, always too hot, or Hold the Hammer Until Your Arms Fall Off. They wouldn't quite fall off, but they certainly felt like it, or the universally popular Try Not to Cry When You Mess Up This Nail, a particularly challenging one, as frustration, heat, and the sheer weight of expectation often conspired against you. There was no gentle hand-holding here, no Montessori-inspired learning through exploration. The learning curve was steep, hot, and often painful. Your father, or rather your master, was a terrifying figure. He was a man whose muscles had been sculpted not by choice, but by endless repetition, by the constant struggle against unyielding iron. His hands, thick and gnarled, resembled nothing so much as ancient tree bark, hardened and deeply grooved by a lifetime of exertion. His usual vocabulary consisted primarily of grunts, and the perpetually echoed command, "Hit it harder." His face carried a permanent scowl etched there perhaps by the smoke that constantly filled the forge, or perhaps by the constant nagging worry of tax collectors and ungrateful customers. He taught you the essentials: how to coax the perfect heat from the forge, how to strike metal so that it bent to your will rather than shattering, how to keep your mouth firmly shut when a particularly unpleasant night decided your work wasn't up to snuff. His teaching style was simple: observe, absorb, and above all, obey. Asking questions was a luxury you couldn't afford. It typically resulted in a flying horseshoe narrowly missing your head, or a week of the silent treatment, which was almost worse: downtime. A quaint, amusing concept. You see, the forge, that temperamental roaring beast, didn't take holidays. And neither by extension did you. There was always someone in the village who needed a tool sharpened, a broken hinge fixed, or a cartwheel reforged. The rhythm of demand was relentless, a constant unspoken pressure. Your free time was simply the brief interval between one urgent job and the next. Moments of quiet before the next customer arrived or the next broken plowshare was thrust into your hands. By the ripe old age of 10, you had accumulated a truly impressive set of skills. You possessed the permanent fragrance of hot iron, a scent that clung to you like a second skin indistinguishable from your own being. You could swear like a seasoned miner, having heard every colorful medieval curse imaginable. Your arms, while still belonging to a child, were strong enough to carry water buckets heavier than a small dog, assuming the dog hadn't wisely run away at the first whiff of your unique aroma. And perhaps most importantly, you had learned the invaluable lessons of pain tolerance, heat resistance, and the subtle, almost mystical ability to fall asleep standing up, a skill that would serve you well throughout your long, laborious days. Welcome then to a life that had truly begun, a life defined by sweat, smoke, and the promise of 70 years of unrelenting back pain. The forge, by the time you reached your teenage years, was no longer just a place of work. It had become an extension of your very being. It was a total immersion, a constant, pervasive presence that dominated every one of your senses, gradually reshaped your growing muscles, and subtly rewired the very pathways of your brain. It transformed from a static workspace into what felt like a living creature, a hot, smoky, incredibly temperamental beast that you had to feed with cold control, with your bellows and hammer, and perhaps most profoundly fear, with a healthy respect for its destructive power. The sensory dominance of the forge was absolute. The sounds formed a brutal medieval symphony, a cacophony that became the very soundtrack of your existence. There was the constant rhythmic wheezing of the bellows drawing breath into the heart of the fire. Then the sharp, almost violent hiss of glowing iron plunging into the quenching water, a sudden release of steam and energy. And of course the singular resonant clang of the hammer striking hot metal, echoing through the confined space like a primal war drum, marking the relentless rhythm that your body unconsciously moved to. These weren't merely noises. They were cues, signals, a language only you and the forge truly understood. The heat, initially a torment, eventually became something you stopped actively noticing. It became a baseline, an accepted constant, much like gravity or the inevitability of taxes. You simply learned to exist within it. You developed an intuitive sense of its subtleties. Which stones around the forge retained the most oppressive heat, which coals burned quickest and hottest, and which parts of the dirt floor were so scorchingly hot they threatened to murder your already protesting feet through your worn leather shoes. Your skin perpetually darkened, not by the gentle kiss of the sun, but by the pervasive clinging smoke absorbed the essence of the forge. Even your clothes, that sooty tunic, the stiff, scorched leather apron, didn't just smell of the forge. They were the forge permeated with the scent of burnt wool, animal grease, and a pervasive, lingering desperation that only another blacksmith could truly understand. It was a strange form of possession. On paper, perhaps you didn't own the forge. It was your father's or the village's or simply an agreed-upon fixture. But in practice, undeniably, it owned you. It claimed your hours, your energy, your focus. Silence for a blacksmith became an unsettling, almost terrifying absence. The constant hiss, the familiar clang, the comforting crackle of the fire. Without them, your ears would ring with an unnatural quiet, causing an almost involuntary twitching, as if your body missed a beat in a forced, memorized song. You were so attuned to the forge's pulse that its absence felt like a limb missing a fundamental disquiet. This deep immersion came with a natural, almost inevitable social isolation. Your friends, those other village children you'd once chased chickens with, were now barely seen. When asked about your whereabouts, the default answer among the villagers was almost certainly, "Oh, he's probably at the forge." Your world was small, bounded by the rough-hewn walls of your workspace, and the only real companionship you had was the inanimate metal and the roaring fire. This relentless dedication gradually brought about a profound shift in your identity. You were no longer simply a young man who happened to be a blacksmith. You were the forge. You became a two-legged extension of the fire and steel, your purpose intrinsically tied to the shaping of metal. Yet amidst the sweat, the soot, and the pervasive ache, a strange, almost inexplicable affection began to stir within you. It wasn't an affection for the endless burns or the perpetual blisters or the grinding exhaustion. No, it was for those fleeting, almost sacred moments when the shape came out just right, when a horseshoe fit perfectly, when a newly forged blade gleamed with a quiet, satisfying brilliance, or when the stubborn, unyielding metal finally bent to your will, a silent testament to your mastery. In those moments, however brief, you transcended the grime and the drudgery. You were a creator, a true crafter, a necessary vital gear in the intricate turning machine of medieval life. And then, almost immediately, the illusion would break, shattered by the next urgent order, the next demand for your skill pulling you back into the relentless rhythm of the fire. The relentless physical toll of the blacksmith's trade was perhaps its most defining characteristic, leaving an indelible mark on the body that defied the very concept of youth. By your teenage years, your frame already felt as if it had endured not just a few hard knocks, but an entire siege. You walked with a nascent stoop, your shoulders already beginning to round forward from countless hours hunched over the anvil shaping, lifting, hammering. Scars, both seen and unseen, crisscrossed your hands and arms, testament to the unforgiving nature of your daily interactions with hot metal. Your movements, even simple ones, were often accompanied by the subtle, almost constant stiffness that belied your actual age. Let's consider the specific ailments, the intimate betrayals of a body pushed beyond its natural limits. Your arms, once slender and youthful, had by now thickened considerably, corded with muscle and sinew, as if they had been repeatedly attacked by anvils and decided in self-defense to become equally unyielding. Your back. Oh, your back was a tragic symphony of aches and knots, hunched from the endless hours spent leaning over the roaring forge, coaxing life into iron or hauling heavy bars of metal from one end of the workshop to the other. Your knees, too, had stories to tell, emitting a low creak with every crouch, every shift in weight, sounding remarkably similar to dry branches scraping against one another in a gentle breeze. And your shoulders. They had developed a peculiar, almost rhythmic pop every few seconds when you lifted the heavy hammer, a unique part of your personal soundtrack, as common and unremarkable as the sound of your own breathing. But it was your hands, those instruments of your craft, that bore the true visible cost of your profession. Once, perhaps you had fingers delicate and nimble like any other child's. Now they were transformed, resembling nothing so much as iron-tipped claws, scarred and calloused beyond recognition. They were perpetually blistered, cracked from the constant exposure to heat and friction, and stained with soot so deeply that you sometimes wondered if the mighty Nile itself could wash away the ingrained darkness. Cuts were a common, almost daily occurrence. Small nicks and deeper gouges from sharp edges or rogue shards of metal. Half your fingernails were permanently blackened or entirely missing, casualties of errant hammer blows or molten splashes. You likely had a vivid memory of that. One time you crushed a thumb, watching in detached horror as it turned a deep, alarming black for 2 agonizing weeks. Yet the work didn't stop. You simply switched hands, grunted through the pain, and found a new way to grip the tongs. Your knuckles, perpetually swollen and gnarled, felt as if they had been mugged by a hammer and left for dead. And your palms. They were a literal map of blisters, layered one upon the other, like the rings of an ancient tree. Each new blister count, a seasonal marker, a painful testament to the passage of time and the relentless grind. There was, of course, no recovery time in the medieval world for a blacksmith. No sick days, no paid leave for strains or sprains. If you pulled a muscle, you simply kept working, perhaps favoring one side over the other for a while. If you twisted your wrist, you used the other one. The forge and the stubborn iron did not wait for your body to heal. They demanded your constant attention, your unending labor, and this exhaustion, this relentless physical torment, crept into your precious, fleeting moments of rest. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fragmented, cruel parody of true repose. Your muscles ached with such intensity that you often couldn't lie still, twitching and turning in search of a fleeting position of comfort. Your ears, even in the deepest dark of night, still rang with the ghost of 10 hours of incessant clanging, a phantom symphony echoing in your skull. Your arms would twitch with phantom swings, sparring with invisible metal, battling the demons of unfinished orders. New aches would materialize in previously unknown places, places you hadn't even realized you possessed. It was as if even your pain had its own pain, and your father, observing your writhing discomfort, your raw hands, your perpetual exhaustion, would simply grunt, perhaps, with a touch of grim satisfaction. Good, you're learning. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply stating a fundamental truth of the trade. Your body was hardening much like the metal you shaped, forged, and tempered by the same forces of heat pressure and relentless repetition. By the time you reached true adulthood, your body wouldn't feel like it had merely lived one life. It would feel like it had lived 2, perhaps even 3, and died halfway through each, all while you were just getting started. Beyond the physical toll, perhaps the most insidious aspect of the blacksmith's life was the environment itself. A choking, toxic workspace that relentlessly invaded every breath and settled deep within your very being. Smoke wasn't just a byproduct of your work. It was a constant co-worker, a particularly rude and pervasive one that never left your side. From the moment you stoked the forge in the pre-dawn gloom until the last ember died down at night, every breath you took was seasoned with a pungent, biting cocktail of coal dust, scorched metal particles, fine ash, and if you were being truly honest with yourself, a good measure of regret. The forge was in essence a choking chamber. Visibility within its confines was rarely more than 6 feet. If you could see much further than that, it usually meant someone, likely yourself, had forgotten to properly light the fire, and thus you were in for an even colder, smokier experience. There were no modern concepts of ventilation, no elaborate systems to extract the noxious fumes. At best, there might have been a crude hole in the roof, a meager concession to the idea of allowing smoke to escape. More often than not, this hole seemed to leak more smoke in than out, creating a stagnant, suffocating atmosphere. Windows were a rarity, or if they existed, they were quickly plastered black with layers of soot, rendering them useless for light or fresh air. And on those days when a strong wind decided to blow, it didn't offer a reprieve. Instead, it simply whipped all the accumulated airborne particulates directly into your eyes, making the already difficult work even more blindingly frustrating. The impact on your respiratory system was profound and undeniable. Your lungs, from a very early age, entered into a long-term, deeply toxic relationship with smoke. Initially, there was the burning sensation, the persistent irritation, the coughing fits that felt like your chest was trying to expel your very soul. But over time, with the grim acceptance that accompanies necessity, this became the new normal. The coughing fits, once alarming, simply became another rhythm in the symphony of the forge, as commonplace as the clang of the hammer. And a particularly unpleasant side effect, a visual testament to the constant internal struggle, was the regular presence of black mucus. Certainly not ideal, but an unfortunate and depressingly consistent reality of your daily existence. It wasn't just the smoke from the coal either. You were constantly inhaling a complex array of other noxious substances. There was the fine metal dust generated from grinding and filing the oily fumes that wafted up from the quenching trough as superheated metal plunged into water, the acrid scent of burnt leather from your apron, and the sharp, dry smell of charred wood from stray splinters or coals that escaped the hearth. You could easily inhale 3 different types of poison before noon, all before you'd even considered your midday meal. Protective gear, of course, was virtually non-existent. At best, you might tie a rag around your face, a piece of fabric that quickly became sweaty gross and you suspected smelled even worse than the smoke. It was ostensibly trying to filter. Taking it off might offer a fleeting sense of clearer breathing, but it also meant gagging on the sweat that had accumulated and the direct assault of the unfiltered air. The long-term health consequences were almost guaranteed chronic asthma. The dreaded black lung from constant coal dust inhalation and an early death were all part of the unwritten career package. These were not concerns that occupied your immediate thoughts, however. Your focus remained squarely on finishing that gate hinge before your father noticed its slight crookedness, or ensuring the next horseshoe was perfectly formed before the metal cooled. The air you breathed wasn't just for survival. It was a mere conduit, a necessary burden that allowed you to keep hammering, to keep the forge alive, to keep the world turning. The tools of your trade were not merely instruments. They were extensions of your will. Yes, but also constant companions in a relationship built on necessity, pain, and a curious mutual disrespect. You knew them intimately, every dent and groove, every balance point. But you also knew the myriad ways they could betray you, jab you, or simply make your life a little more miserable. Foremost among them was the hammer, the iconic symbol of your craft. It was more than just a tool. It was an extension of your arm, a physical manifestation of your strength and precision. You probably named it perhaps something simple and direct, like old iron, or something more colorful and expressive in your moments of frustration. You certainly cursed it with a regular frequency, especially on those days when your aim was off or the metal stubbornly refused to yield. You had swung that hammer so many times for so many hours over so many years that your shoulder now clicked with a soft, persistent rhythm like a haunted maraca, keeping time with your efforts. Yet for all the pain it inflicted, it was utterly indispensable. It made you a blacksmith defining your very profession, and with an almost poetic irony, it also made you bleed with a predictable regularity. Then there were the tongs, your most frequent and often most frustrating companions for handling hot metal. They were clumsy, perpetually hot, and possessed an uncanny knack for pinching at precisely the wrong moment, usually when you were trying to precisely maneuver a glowing piece of iron. You had burned your fingertips more times trying to use them than you had successfully picked anything up with grace or ease. There were countless moments when the smooth, searing iron would slip from their grip, sending sparks flying and forcing a yell of frustration from your throat. Your father, ever the fount of blunt wisdom, would simply advise you to grip it like you mean it, as if mere intention could overcome the inherent awkwardness of the tool. In your private moments of exasperation, you might even have considered throwing the recalcitrant things directly back into the fire from which they had just extracted something. The chisel used for shaping, splitting, and scoring the metal was another staple. It was probably once sharp, a keen edge that bit cleanly into the surface. But after years of relentless use of being struck with the hammer, it had likely dulled to what you might describe as mostly a suggestion of a blade. Yet it was versatile, not just for its primary purpose, but also for scraping off stubborn rust, or in moments of desperation prying open a stuck door in the perpetually damp and shifting forge. Other tools filled out your bench files for smoothing awls, for piercing punch tools, for creating holes, rivet sets for fastening. Each had its specific purpose, and each had its own unique way of inflicting a minor injury. Indeed, your entire tool bench often felt less like a collection of helpful implements and more like a miniature torture rack. Your fingers were constantly jabbed, crushed, pinched, and sliced by every single item you owned. Your hands, calloused as they were, would flinch almost instinctively at the mere sight of a new tool, already anticipating the inevitable small injury it would inflict. And then there was the apron, that thick, heavy piece of leather that was meant to protect you from the worst of the sparks and heat. In practice, however, it seemed to catch hot metal shards with malicious glee, holding them close to your body like a smoldering, unwanted hug, scorching the very cloth it was meant to shield. More scorched than stitched it bore the silent history of every accident, every near miss. In winter, the leather would stiffen, becoming as unyielding as a corpse, making movement even more laborious. Yet despite this relationship based on pain and necessity, you cared for your tools with an almost paradoxical tenderness, like estranged family members you grudgingly depended on. You would sharpen them diligently, oil them to prevent rust, and line them up nightly, not out of aesthetic pride, but out of sheer survival. If one broke, your livelihood was threatened. You couldn't work, couldn't earn, couldn't eat. Your tools were your life, but they were also engaged in a quiet, relentless war on your fingers, your spine, and your sanity. Every day they seemed to whisper their unspoken pact. We help you survive, but we'll also slowly destroy you. And your only response, a weary sigh as you reached for the next implement, was, "Yeah, that sounds about right. Now pass the hammer." In the intricate tapestry of medieval village life, the blacksmith was an unsung hero, a fundamental pillar upon which the entire community quietly depended. He didn't wear a gleaming crown, nor did he carry a ceremonial sword, and he certainly didn't lead armies into glorious battle. Yet without him, you could be certain the village would quite literally cease to function by Tuesday. He was the indispensable cog, the vital link in a chain of daily survival, performing a multifaceted role that made him the medieval equivalent of customer service tech support and roadside assistance, all rolled into one perpetually soot-covered figure who invariably smelled of smoke, and if you were being honest, a subtle hint of desperation and shame. The demands on your time and skill were constant, relentless, and often arrived without warning or courtesy. A knight passing through or residing at the local keep would inevitably need a new sword forged, or his existing blade sharpened to a lethal edge. A farmer perpetually battling the stubborn earth would break a plowshare, an event that meant instant halt to his essential work until you could fix it. The monk responsible for the spiritual well-being of the village might find his heavy church bell cracked, its solemn peal silenced until your skillful hands could mend it. The baker, the lifeblood of daily sustenance, would find his oven door jammed, threatening the bread supply. And the humble shepherd, his flock vulnerable, might discover his gate latch wouldn't close, leaving his livelihood exposed. For every single one of these problems, great or small, you were called upon. Every single time. And the customers, bless their entitled hearts, rarely possessed any concept of courtesy or respect for your time. They would show up unannounced often while you were mid-swing, covered in the mud of their fields or the dust of their journeys, and dripping with an almost aristocratic sense of entitlement. "I know you're busy." They would begin that haunting familiar phrase, "But could you just..." This could be anything from a simple nail to an intricate repair that would take hours of painstaking work. They would stand there perhaps tapping their foot or sighing dramatically, as if your existence was solely for their convenience. Gratitude, sadly, was a luxury you seldom received. People simply assumed it was your duty, that you were born to serve their needs. They would nod curtly, perhaps, even with a hint of thinly veiled impatience, and then walk away, as if you were the lucky one for having been granted the privilege of repairing their rusty bucket for half a loaf of stale bread. Payment, when it came, was often as inconsistent as the demands. Sometimes it was coin, a rare and welcome sight. More often it was in goods, a sack of flour, a few eggs, a measure of ale, or most frustratingly, empty promises of future payment that were conveniently forgotten by harvest time. You even remembered one particularly memorable occasion when a man paid you with a dead chicken, a skeletal bird that was certainly not good for stew, much less a decent meal. You were in essence the go-to fixer for every problem that involved metal, whether it was genuinely your realm or not. Bent hinges not from age but from someone sitting on a gate. A broken dagger clearly the result of a drunken brawl rather than honest wear and tear. Mysterious, unidentifiable pieces of iron that someone had dug up and insisted must have some purpose. You were expected to divine their needs, mend their mistakes, and restore their broken implements as if by magic. In the social hierarchy, you occupied a peculiar, indispensable, yet largely uncelebrated position. When the village celebrated, it was the knight for his bravery, the priest for his wisdom, or the miller for his industry. The blacksmith is background noise, a necessary evil, a reliable tool, but never quite a person in their eyes. Yet beneath this lack of recognition lay a hidden power, a quiet knowledge that sustained you through the endless days. You knew with absolute certainty that they couldn't last a week without your work. Their fields would stall, their homes would fall apart, their horses would limp, their very ability to feed themselves and protect their families would crumble. Their entire world, in its quiet, unassuming way, was held together by your hands, by the strength you put into every swing, every bend, every weld. And that in your quiet, smoke-filled heart was a form of power more profound than any crown. For the medieval blacksmith, the concept of peace was paradoxically a rather terrible one, at least where business was concerned. It's a harsh truth, but what truly paid the bills, what kept the forge roaring and the coins jingling in your worn leather purse, was war. The greater the conflict, the more frequent the skirmishes, the more urgent the need for your specific grueling skills. Consider the contrast. During times of widespread fighting, or even just localized raiding and banditry, your workshop became a hub of frantic activity. Knights, squires, and even common soldiers would descend upon you desperate for new weapons for their dented and battered armor to be repaired, for hundreds upon hundreds of arrowheads to be forged, each one sharp and true. Horseshoes, under the relentless stress of panicked cavalry charges or long, arduous marches, would wear down faster than you could possibly imagine, requiring constant replacement. Work would flood in an overwhelming deluge, but a welcome one. The forge would burn brighter, longer, its heat a constant presence in the cold, uncertain nights. And most importantly, coins, real, tangible coins, would roll in with a satisfying regularity, allowing you to pay your debts at the alehouse, perhaps even buy a bit of extra meat for your family's pottage. You might be utterly exhausted, your body screaming in protest, but your belly would be full, and the gnawing anxiety of an empty purse would for a precious few weeks or months momentarily recede. Then peace would descend. A truce declared, a treaty signed. The knights stopped their marching and returned to their keeps. And with the cessation of hostilities, the flood of orders would suddenly dramatically vanish. Instead of urgent requests for broadswords and chainmail, you would find yourself facing the more mundane and far less lucrative demands of village life. Farmers would ask you to sharpen a sickle, perhaps offering 3 onions as a paltry payment. Household goods, a new cauldron, a sturdy door handle, a cooking spit, were necessary certainly, but they yielded little profit, barely enough to keep the embers glowing. You were still expected to work with the skill and precision of a wizard to make magic from raw iron, but you were paid with the meager wages of a stable boy. The economic struggle became a constant nagging companion. You were forced to become not just a craftsman, but a negotiator, a subtle beggar, a reluctant merchant, haggling for what you believed was a decent wage for your brutal labor. Raising your prices even marginally would make people look at you as if you had personally cursed their prize cow. "You're just hammering metal," they would say with a dismissive wave of the hand, as if molten iron bent itself into shape while singing hymns, or as if the sheer physical effort was merely a pleasant pastime. They failed to grasp that the very ease with which you could shape the hot metal was the result of decades of pain and countless blisters. In those quieter times, a strange, almost shameful nostalgia for chaos would begin to creep in. Not for the senseless bloodshed or the burning of homes, no, but for the steady flow of orders, for the undeniable purpose your work then had, for the frantic rush of knights lining up with their dented shields, and crucially their ready coin purses. In those moments of war, you mattered in a way you never did during peace. You were essential, irreplaceable. Now, during peacetime, you found yourself making keys for doors no one bothered to lock, patching pots that really should have been thrown out years ago, and fixing tools that looked old enough for a museum, their original purpose long forgotten. Deep down, a whisper would emerge, a thought so base, so contrary to the natural order that you would never speak it aloud. But part of you, the part that remembered the warmth of a full belly and the relief of a clear ledger, would whisper, "Wouldn't mind a small skirmish. Just a little one. Maybe a minor border dispute." Peace for the medieval blacksmith often meant economic anxiety, the quiet gnawing of hunger, and the disheartening realization that your most valuable skills were only truly appreciated when the world was tearing itself apart. The blacksmith's work was a never-ending cycle, a relentless, unyielding grind that offered no true finish. Not today, not tomorrow, not even in the restless depths of your dreams. The concept of a to-do list implied a point of completion, a final check mark, a moment of satisfaction where one could declare the work done. Such a concept simply did not exist within the walls of the forge. You see, in a world built largely of wood and held together by rudimentary fasteners, things broke with an alarming regularity. You'd fix one thing, and it felt as if 3 more immediately sprang into disrepair. You'd spend a painstaking hour patching a gate hinge only for a cartwheel to fall off as the farmer was halfway down the road. You might finish a batch of nails, the very ones you had spent days hammering out, only for a demanding merchant to arrive insisting he needed 10 more longer ones, and naturally they wouldn't be paid for until the distant harvest. It was a perpetual game of catch-up, where the catch was always just out of reach, and the up was a constantly shifting uphill battle. Your schedule was unforgiving, a testament to the primal demands of your trade. You rose before the sun, often long before the first faint blush of dawn touched the horizon to coax the embers back to life, and you rarely slept until long after the sun had fully set, the last sparks having faded into the encroaching darkness. Even then, your brain, wired by years of rhythmic labor, kept hammering. Your dreams were often a chaotic tapestry of bellows, wheezing phantom sparks flying, and the insistent murmurs of unpaid customer debts. There was no true mental respite, no genuine silence where the mind could fully disengage. Customers, with their eternal optimism and singular focus on their own problems, would often arrive with a mangled rake, proclaiming with unwarranted cheerfulness that it just needs a little fixing. This seemingly simple request, a deceptive little phrase invariably translated into at least 2 hours of painstaking, arduous labor, reheating the twisted tines, reshaping the warped metal, hammering out the kinks, and all the while politely nodding to their constant irritating refrain of, "Is it ready yet?" You were everyone else's last resort, the one person with the skill and brute strength to salvage their broken world. Just when you thought you might, for a precious few moments, sit down on a rough-hewn stool or perhaps take a sip of something that wasn't lukewarm and tasted faintly of smoke, your apprentice would burst in wild-eyed. "Master, the friar's ill, and you need to shoe his horse immediately." Or a frantic neighbor would appear breathlessly explaining that a storm had ripped a door from its hinges and it simply must be rehung before nightfall. Or worst of all, a noble's rider would arrive demanding an urgent sharpening of a sword for a hunt that simply could not wait until morning, as if the noble's leisure was somehow more vital than your desperate need for rest. Your personal need for rest was never a consideration for anyone else. You were an always-on service provider, your skills available at any hour. The forge itself, that living entity, demanded constant attention. The fire, if left untended for even a short while, would lose its heat and refuse to stoke itself back to life easily. Your tools, if neglected, would quickly succumb to rust. The heavy anvil, the very foundation of your work, might shift on its base, threatening to throw off your balance. The bellows, crucial for air, would inevitably crack or tear, requiring immediate laborious repair. It seemed that everything around you was either actively falling apart or constantly threatening to do so, a never-ending cycle of maintenance and repair. Even Sunday, technically, a day of rest and devotion, wasn't sacred. Unless, of course, an ox cart broke on its way to the market carrying precious goods for sale. Then, half awake and still clad in your singed apron, you'd find yourself hammering away, praying the priest doesn't catch sight of you desecrating the Lord's day with the clamor of your trade. It was a cycle, a fundamental rhythm of existence. Work, fix, repeat. A pattern that continued until your body finally gave out or your trusty hammer shattered. And the most peculiar, frustrating part of it all? You kind of loved it. This constant, brutal engagement with the world, this unyielding necessity, it gave your life a raw, undeniable purpose. The life of a medieval blacksmith. A ceaseless ballet of muscle and molten metal should by all rights have earned you the hearty rewards of good food and solid, uninterrupted sleep. You pounded hot iron from sunup to sundown, burning calories at a rate that would make a modern athlete gasp, expending energy like a runaway horse in a desperate gallop. Yet the brutal irony was that these fundamental human necessities remained elusive luxuries, often scant and never truly guaranteed. Food for you was less about enjoyment and more about pure utilitarian survival. Your meals were rarely culinary delights. They consisted primarily of coarse, unyielding bread so dense it could double as a building material, and a bowl of cold pottage that might, if you were lucky, contain a few chunks of yesterday's turnip, perhaps a sliver of dried peas. Meat, if it appeared at all, was likely a meager bit of salted pork reserved only for a truly special day, a day which you quickly learned almost never materialized. You ate standing up, one hand still clutching the tongs, the other shielding your meager portion from the ever-present ash and coal dust that seemed to settle on everything. Meals were rushed, often accompanied by grunted conversations, or more commonly by no conversation at all. Just the sounds of mastication and the ambient clang of the forge. Any interruption, a stuck latch, or a demand for a quick repair meant your already unappetizing stew would grow even colder, congealing into an even less palatable mass. Eating was simply a process of fuel in, hammer out, a necessity to keep the machine of your body operational, not a moment of pleasure or communal gathering. Sleep, that blessed restorative, was for you a cruel parody of true rest. By the time you finally crawled into your bed, your hands would be throbbing with a persistent ache, your back feeling as if it lost a protracted bar fight, and your ears still ringing with the ghost of 10,000 hammer strikes. Your bed was a simple straw-stuffed sack, a lumpy flat expanse that promised little comfort and often came with the unwelcome company of mysterious crawling things. Your blanket was a scorched wool sheet, a rough fabric permeated with the omnipresent smells of forge smoke, old ale, and a lingering existential regret. Just as your eyes would finally begin to close, just as the promise of oblivion began to beckon your mind, cruel and unyielding, would snap awake remembering a litany of unfinished orders of hinges that needed attention, of unpaid wagon wheels, of tools that required sharpening. Sleep became less a natural state and more a negotiation. You would lie awake, tossing and turning on your rough straw mattress, calculating the precise amount of time repairs could be delayed, how much time you could steal before the insistent, unignorable banging of dawn customers would begin. And even if you managed to drift off, the world rarely left you in peace. A horse might throw a shoe in the dead of night. A storm might rip a door from its hinges. Or most infuriatingly, a noble's rider might pound on your door, demanding an urgent sharpening of his master's sword for a hunt that simply could not wait until morning, as if the noble's leisure was somehow more vital than your desperate need for rest. Your personal need for rest was never a consideration for anyone else. You were an always-on service provider, your skills available at any hour. You learned early and irrevocably to exist in a perpetual state of survival mode. You survived on scraps of food, snatched bites, half-naps, stolen in moments of quiet and sheer stubborn willpower. Productivity always came before nourishment, deadlines before dozing. Food and sleep were not breaks in the normal sense. They were merely intermissions between hammer swings, brief moments of necessary pause before the relentless performance resumed. And as you finally drifted off, your last conscious thought was often a silent, weary prayer that the fire in the forge, that heart of your world, wouldn't go out while you were dreaming. One of the most defining and perhaps least celebrated aspects of the medieval blacksmith's life was the permanent scent that clung to him, a professional aroma that preceded him, followed him, and permeated every fiber of his existence. You hadn't smelled genuinely clean since you were perhaps 5 years old, a fleeting memory of childhood purity. From that point onward, your personal fragrance became an intricate blend of unwashed ashtray mixed with burnt bacon and a distinct undertone of desperation. It was an olfactory signature, unmistakable and indelible. The forge, that roaring heart of your world, burned all day, every day. And in a strange, almost alchemical way, so did you. The smoke, thick and pervasive, didn't just drift around you. It seeped into your clothes, your hair, and most profoundly into your skin. It settled into the very pores, a fine, gritty layer that no amount of scrubbing could fully dislodge. Your sweat, a constant companion in the oppressive heat, didn't smell like regular human perspiration. It was transformed by the ambient conditions, taking on the peculiar tang of smoked meat left out during a particularly warm spring day. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was a concept utterly alien to your daily reality. Bathing was a rare and laborious affair. Water was cold, often had to be drawn from a distant well, and the sheer effort involved in cleaning yourself seemed utterly pointless when you knew you'd be covered in soot grease and coal dust again before the sun had even fully risen. What's the point was a question you likely asked yourself on those rare occasions you contemplated a thorough wash. Your clothes, the same singed tunic and scorched leather apron worn day in and day out, were rarely, if ever, truly clean. They hadn't seen the purifying touch of fresh water since the last festival, perhaps, or even longer. Instead, they had become a protective layer of hardened funk, stiffened by accumulated grime, perpetually stiff with dried sweat and metallic residue. Any fleeting attempts at freshness were doomed to immediate failure. A dab of perfume, if you were so inclined and could even acquire such a luxury, would last perhaps 10 minutes before the relentless atmosphere of the forge would simply eat it alive, replacing its delicate notes with the insistent smell of burning coal. You had likely noticed that flowers wilted unnervingly quickly in your presence, and bread inexplicably seemed to go stale faster when you were near. Even the village cats, usually indifferent to human scent, would sometimes hiss softly as you passed. People noticed, of course. You were, after all, the most aromatic man in the village. At the tavern, the crowd would subtly part like the Red Sea as you approached, creating a clear, if unintentional, path for you. The innkeeper, with a practiced subtlety, would seat you in a corner invariably near the draftiest window, a gesture not of courtesy, but of sheer self-preservation. Yet you took it all in stride. A little public shame was a small price to pay compared to going utterly unnoticed. You were known. "That's the blacksmith." People would murmur a phrase uttered with a peculiar mix of respect for your skill and a palpable nasal discomfort. In a strange way, this pervasive scent became a part of your professional identity, a badge of honor, albeit an odorous one. Smelling like fire meant you were working. Smelling like iron meant you were crafting. Smelling like sweat-soaked leather dipped in soot and regret meant you were a professional, a master of your trade. It was the smell of honest labor, of tireless effort, of a life undeniably lived at the very heart of the community's survival. And in your world, that mattered more than any sweet-smelling perfume. For the medieval blacksmith, the concept of choice, especially regarding one's life path, was largely an illusion. You didn't choose this life in the way one might choose a profession in a more modern age. Instead, the forge chose you, its destiny, reaching out through your father's calloused hands, and the unyielding iron expectations passed down like a rusty yet invaluable heirloom. It was an unspoken, deeply ingrained understanding that had persisted for generations, a legacy of soot and steel that predated memory. So, when your own son came of age, his apprenticeship was not a question, but a natural progression, an inevitability. You watched him not playing with fanciful wooden swords like the sons of knights, nor running wild and carefree like the children of farmers. No, his earliest games were inextricably linked to the forge. He would fetch coal, his tiny arms straining under the weight of the rough sacks. He would learn to pump the bellows with a steady, rhythmic motion vital for keeping the fire alive. And he would stand beside you holding the tongs, perhaps learning the precise angle and pressure needed, receiving your muttered, often gruff instruction, "Don't flinch." By the tender age of 7, he already carried the faint yet unmistakable scent of burnt metal and wet burlap, a fragrance that would become his own signature. A subtle pang of guilt might occasionally ripple through you, a fleeting thought about the harshness of the life you were passing on. But it was only a bit of guilt quickly dismissed, for you knew deep in your core that you weren't being cruel. You were, in fact, doing the only thing you could, preparing him. You were equipping him with the skills necessary for his survival in this brutal world, passing down a trade that was both indispensable and relentless. You were ensuring he would have a purpose, a means to feed himself and his future family. You remembered that look in your son's wide eyes as he watched you swing the heavy hammer, a gaze that was a complex mixture of awe and fear. awe for the raw power you commanded over the unyielding metal, and fear perhaps of the inevitable pain and exhaustion that would soon be his own. It was the same look you yourself had once given your own father. And now you finally understood. Your father hadn't been a man of stone devoid of emotion. He had been a man shaped by exhaustion and the profound weight of responsibility. You taught your son the fundamental, almost intuitive lessons of the forge, how to gauge the heat of the iron by its ever-shifting color from dull red to searing white, knowing precisely when to strike. You taught him to tap the metal, not slam it, understanding that persuasion was often more effective than brute force. You taught him to listen to the metal to understand its subtle whispers as it cooled and changed, anticipating its resistance. You tried in your own gruff, inarticulate way to soften the harshness of the lessons. You might tell him a short story by the dying fire at the end of a long day, or offer him a rare piece of dried fruit you'd managed to acquire. But tenderness, you knew, didn't last long in the relentless environment of the forge. There was simply too much work to be done. You knew with a certainty born of experience that his hands would eventually look like yours, gnarled and scarred. His back would begin to ache long before his voice truly broke. He would learn to sleep through the incessant ringing in his ears, and he would wake before sunrise driven by the internal clock of the forge, without ever needing to be told. He would outgrow his clothes, but never the burn marks that would become a part of his skin. And then, inevitably, when your own body finally began its inevitable surrender, when your knees finally gave out, your shoulders refused to lift the hammer, and your lungs could no longer draw enough air to keep pace, your son would be there. He would seamlessly pick up the hammer that you could no longer lift, and the relentless cycle would continue. Some might call it unfair, this predetermined destiny. But in your world, this was simply how it had always been, a powerful, unbroken lineage of soot steel and survival. You weren't raising your son to be cruel or to suffer needlessly. You were raising him because someone always had to keep the fire going. The brutal, unyielding nature of the blacksmith's life meant that the body's final surrender was not a matter of if, but inevitably of when. A lifetime spent standing too close to the searing fire, swinging far too much iron, and breathing far too little clean air, inevitably exacted its cumulative toll. There was no escaping the steady decline, no deferring the inevitable reckoning with decades of physical exertion and environmental assault. The physical deterioration was gradual at first, a creeping weariness, then an accelerating cascade of ailments. Your knees, those long-suffering joints, began to creak with a sound like wooden doors groaning open and shut in a howling storm, protesting every bend, every step. Your back, once capable of lifting and twisting with surprising agility, now stubbornly refused to straighten, locking into a permanent hunched curve that mirrored your endless hours leaning over the anvil. Your fingers, which had once possessed the steel-bending strength and precision to shape the most intricate of works, now trembled noticeably, even when attempting the simple act of lifting a cup of water to your parched lips. The roar of the forge might still fill the small workshop, calling for your strength, but your arms, once so eager to answer, would increasingly refuse to obey their muscles, withered and weakened. The hammer, that extension of your will, began to feel impossibly heavy, as if it too knew that it was nearly time for it to slip from your weakening grip. There would be no heroic end for the medieval blacksmith. No blaze of glory, no stirring ballad sung of your final mighty blow. You simply slowed down. The transition of work to your son would be gradual, almost imperceptible at first. You would start by handing off the heavier, more demanding tasks, then the more intricate ones that required a steady hand and keen eye. You would sit more, watch more, your presence a silent, observing ghost in the very place you had once dominated. You might even struggle to remember the answers to your son's earnest questions, the knowledge that had once flowed so freely now elusive like smoke curling away into the rafters. And with this decline came a subtle shift in recognition from the villagers. While they would still nod respectfully to you as you sat by the forge, perhaps offering a quiet greeting, their requests for repairs, their urgent demands would now be directed to your son, the one with fresh, calloused hands. The newest burns the aching muscles that signaled the true burden of the craft had shifted. Yet in those quiet moments, a deep abiding pride would settle within you. You had never been wealthy, had owned no land beyond your small plot, no books or fine clothes beyond your working attire. But you had been necessary. You had kept the swords sharp, the wheels turning, the gates swinging smoothly, the farms working the very fabric of their lives held together by your tireless efforts. The world had rarely thanked you, had often taken your work for granted, but it had undeniably moved because of you. You knew, too, that your lifespan was likely short. Most blacksmiths, bowed by the cumulative damage, did not see 50. The blackened lungs, the ground-down joints, the worn-out heart, these were the inevitable costs of your career. But when you were gone, your work would remain the sturdy nails in the church door, the keen blades at noble hips, the horses shod with the shoes your hands had hammered. You would leave no grand titles, just the simple tools of your trade, the indelible scars etched onto your body, and a son strong and capable with a hammer in his hand. And that in your quiet elemental world was more than enough. Your burial would be simple, likely a plain grave marked by a name carved in wood, no grand monument or gilded statue. But the forge, the very heart of your life, would continue to burn in memory. Every clang of the hammer echoing through the village long after you were gone would be the sound of you still working a resonant legacy. You weren't a knight yet. You made the armor that protected them. You didn't farm yet. You forged the plows that fed everyone. You didn't bake yet. You crafted the oven doors that made their bread possible. You didn't build the castle, but every nail, every hinge, every piece of iron that held it together had been touched by your fire. To be a blacksmith, that in your world meant everything. You were in essence the very foundation of civilization. While nobles argued and kings changed hands, you were quietly shaping the world piece by piece. Thousands of small things, the rivets, the hooks, the braces, the buckles, they didn't draw crowds or inspire bards, but they quietly held the world together. Your life was loud with the clang of hammer on anvil, but your legacy was a quiet, almost invisible one. There might be no songs of your hammer, no bard praising your tongs, but every working wheel, every unbroken sword, every swinging barn door that in its silent functionality was you. People saw the smoke, smelled the sweat and soot, and assumed that was all there was. But inside that rough exterior, inside the tireless rhythm, was a symphony of heat and steel, of creation and endurance. You didn't just forge iron. You forged civilization itself, one horseshoe, one blade, one nail at a time. The eternal ember passed from your father to you now, continued through your son, and one day his grandson. Your name might fade into the annals of local memory, but your tools, your techniques, and the very items you created would carry on. You were never crowned, never publicly honored, never widely celebrated. But without him, nothing moved. You were the foundation beneath the history books, the glowing ember beneath the stories of kings, and that you knew mattered more than anyone ever said aloud. You were the silent spark, the man who turned raw ore into progress, who wasn't just part of the world, but kept it turning. Having immersed ourselves in the gritty, smoke-filled reality of the medieval blacksmith, It's perhaps useful to widen our gaze for a moment to understand where this indispensable figure fit within the broader social tapestry of his time. To truly appreciate the brutal singularity of his existence, it helps to cast a contrasting glance towards those who in the intricate hierarchy of medieval society occupied vastly different spheres. Consider, for instance, the medieval lord or lady ensconced in their castle walls, their lives shaped by very different rhythms and expectations, yet undeniably reliant on the very skills you, the blacksmith, honed with your calloused hands. Imagine for a moment the day in the life of a lord, a man whose entire world revolved around matters of land loyalty and warfare. He would wake not to the pre-dawn chill of a forge, but in a thick curtained bed, perhaps with feather mattresses, a luxury utterly alien to your straw-stuffed sack. His chamber, while not necessarily warm, would be far removed from the direct radiating heat and fumes of the forge. His morning ablutions might involve a basin of warm water brought by servants, rather than the quick, infrequent splash from a cold well. His breakfast would be substantial, consisting of fine bread, perhaps roasted meats, and ale consumed leisurely while receiving reports from his bailiff or strategizing with his knights. From his perspective, the blacksmith was a necessary part of the ecosystem, much like the miller or the baker, but a part that operated largely in the background, a means to an end. When the lord's finest sword needed sharpening for an impending hunt, or more gravely for a battle, his expectation was immediate and absolute. He would dispatch a servant, perhaps even a squired knight, with a curt command, utterly oblivious to the ongoing projects, the exhaustion, or the inherent danger of your trade. There would be no polite request, merely an order, a directive from a superior to a subordinate. His concern was the sharpness of his blade, not the aching back or blistered hands of the man who sharpened it. Similarly, the lady of the castle, her days filled with managing the household weaving, perhaps overseeing the preparation of elaborate meals, would have her own demands. A broken latch on a chest containing her finest silks, a damaged hinge on a heavy wooden door, perhaps even an intricate piece of ironwork for her private chapel. These were tasks that required the blacksmith's touch. To her, the blacksmith was a skilled artisan, certainly, but also a utility, a resource to be drawn upon as needed. She wouldn't envision the soot-filled lungs or the constant threat of burns. She would simply desire the item fixed and fixed promptly, with the quiet assumption that such a service was simply available like the sun rising in the morning. Their world was one of command and expectation, where the intricate dance of their lives was facilitated by a vast network of commoners of whom the blacksmith was a vital yet rarely acknowledged component. The very concept of a blacksmith's daily grind, the constant physical struggle, the pervasive discomfort, would likely be entirely alien to their experience. Their challenges were different, managing vast estates, navigating complex feudal loyalties, ensuring the security of their lands, arranging advantageous marriages. These were mental and political battles waged in the quiet confines of stone halls, far removed from the rhythmic clang of the hammer. They understood that weapons, tools, and implements were essential, but they understood them as finished products, not as the painful, laborious processes of their creation. Their appreciation, when it existed, was for the result, not the human cost behind it. Their world was built upon the tireless, often invisible efforts of people like you, the blacksmith, whose very existence was about shaping the raw materials that underpinned their privilege. To further illuminate the blacksmith's solitary, arduous path, let us briefly turn our attention to another figure of medieval society, one whose daily existence often stood in stark contrast to the physical toil and grime of the forge, the medieval priest or monk. While not necessarily occupying the absolute pinnacle of the social hierarchy, their lives were often marked by a distinct absence of physical hardship, a focus on intellectual and spiritual pursuits that were utterly alien to the blacksmith's world. Imagine the dawn breaking over a monastery or a small village church. For the monk, his day would begin not with the arduous task of stoking a smoky fire, but with quiet contemplation and prayer in the cool, echoing confines of the chapel. His early hours might be spent in scholarly pursuits, meticulously copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, his hands guided by quill and ink, not by the heavy, unforgiving grip of tongs. He would be surrounded by books, by the quiet rustle of parchment, by the hushed whispers of sacred texts. His mind would grapple with theological questions, with the intricacies of Latin, with the careful transcription of ancient knowledge. His challenges were intellectual, spiritual, internal, battles waged within the mind and soul, not against stubborn iron or the searing heat of a furnace. His meals, while perhaps simple and ascetic, would be consumed in relative quiet and cleanliness, likely in a communal refectory far from the ash and chaos of the forge. He would experience no constant interruptions, no urgent demands for a broken plowshare or a bent hinge. His conversations would be theological or philosophical, conducted in a calm, measured tone, rather than the grunts and curt commands exchanged over a noisy anvil. His body, though perhaps disciplined by fasting or manual labor in the monastic gardens, would never know the bone-deep ache, the perpetual tremor, or the ingrained scars of the blacksmith. He might experience the discomfort of cold stone floors in winter, but never the searing pain of a fresh burn. The priest ministering to the local village also inhabited a different sphere. His days would be filled with Mass, with confessions, with visiting the sick, with offering guidance and spiritual comfort. He might perform baptisms, weddings, and funerals, marking the significant milestones of the villagers' lives. His hands, though perhaps calloused from tending a small garden or from the physical demands of ritual, would be clean, unburdened by the pervasive soot and grease of the forge. His garments, while humble, would be clean and distinct, setting him apart from the working populace. His intellect would be engaged in sermons, in theological discussion, in pastoral care. Yet even these figures, seemingly so far removed from the blacksmith's brutal reality, were subtly, implicitly reliant on his skills. The monk's precious manuscripts were bound with iron clasps forged by blacksmiths. The bells that called the faithful to prayer, those resonant symbols of spiritual devotion, were crafted and repaired by the blacksmith's hammer. The very door hinges on the church, the lock on the monastery's gate, the simple cross at the altar, all bore the touch of the forge. The priest might require a new lock for the church pour box, or a repair to the communal well's iron handle. These were minor needs, perhaps, but critical to the daily functioning of their sacred spaces. Their relationship with the blacksmith, therefore, was one of utility, a distant necessity. They understood intellectually that the blacksmith was a part of the village, a necessary service provider. But they had no direct visceral understanding of the sheer physical torment, the constant danger, or the relentless, never-ending nature of the work. Their world was one of spiritual contemplation and intellectual pursuit, built ironically upon the silent, unacknowledged physical foundations laid by the very hands they barely saw, hands perpetually stained with the marks of their brutal, indispensable craft. They inhabited a world of abstract thought, while the blacksmith remained firmly rooted in the tangible shaping, the very material reality of their existence. Let us now cast our gaze upon another essential component of the medieval social fabric, one that, while also sharing in the harsh realities of common life, faced a distinctly different set of challenges, and crucially relied entirely on the blacksmith's unheralded skill, the medieval farmer or shepherd. These were the true bedrock of society, the ones who coaxed sustenance from the earth and guarded the flocks, their lives intimately tied to the cycles of nature. Their struggles were profound, yet often diametrically opposed to the blacksmith's, emphasizing just how singular and specialized your brutal craft truly was. Imagine the life of a medieval farmer. His day would begin with the pre-dawn chill much like yours, but it would be the chill of an open field, not the radiating heat of a forge. His hands, though calloused, would be shaped by the persistent grip of the plow handle, the scythe, the hoe. His muscles would ache from bending over the soil, from hauling sacks of grain, from wrestling with stubborn oxen. His struggles were against the capricious weather, the sudden drought that withered his crops, the relentless rains that turned his fields to mud, the unexpected frost that stole his harvest. His enemies were blight pests and the ever-present threat of famine. His victories were measured in the plumpness of his grain, the health of his livestock, the promise of a bountiful harvest that would sustain his family through the long winter. For the shepherd life was one of constant vigilance. He spent his days and nights under the open sky, exposed to the elements, guiding his flock across vast pastures. His hands would be rough from handling sheep, his eyes sharp from scanning the horizon for predators or stray lambs. His battle was against wolves, against disease that could decimate his flock, against the brutal cold of winter nights. His comfort was the warmth of his flock, the loyal companionship of his dog, and the deep silent connection to the land. Yet despite their different struggles, the farmer and the shepherd were utterly, profoundly dependent on the blacksmith. The farmer's very livelihood, his ability to feed himself and the entire village, hinged on the integrity of his tools. His plowshare, that vital instrument for breaking the earth, was a constant source of demand. It would break against a stubborn rock or dull with relentless use, and without your skilled hands to repair or reforge it, his fields would lie fallow. His family would go hungry, and the entire village would feel the ripple effect. His hoes, his axes for clearing land, his sickles for harvesting, all of these were products of your forge, and their continued functionality was paramount. Similarly, the shepherd relied on your craft. His shearing tools needed constant sharpening. His crooks, if broken, needed to be mended, and most importantly, for the health and mobility of his flock, the hooves of his sheep, and particularly any working dogs, occasionally required trimming tools or even rudimentary shoes. More directly, the farmer's and shepherd's reliance on horses or oxen for plowing and transport meant a steady stream of horseshoeing work for you. A lame horse was a disaster for a farmer halting all work. You were the one who made that mobility possible. Their daily interactions with you would be driven by desperate need. They wouldn't approach you with casual demands, but with an urgent sense of necessity. They would bring you a twisted plow, their faces etched with worry, perhaps offering a promise of a future share of the harvest, as payment their last remaining coin, or even a few eggs if times were particularly hard. They understood perhaps more intimately than the lord or priest the raw, brutal reality of physical labor. They might not fully grasp the blacksmith's unique skill, but they understood the concept of hard work of bodies pushed to their limits, of the struggle against an unforgiving world. In your shared experiences of relentless toil, there was a quiet, unspoken camaraderie, a mutual understanding born of lives lived by the sweat of their brows and the strength of their hands. They provided the food, you provided the tools. Together you kept the medieval world from grinding to a halt. To fully grasp the blacksmith's place in the medieval world, we must also consider the broader economic structure of the medieval village and how your specialized trade fit into this intricate system of patronage, commerce, and mutual dependence. Unlike the relatively fluid markets of today, the medieval economy was deeply localized, often based on barter, and heavily influenced by social standing and established relationships. Your forge, humble as it was, stood as a critical node within this localized network. You were not simply a craftsman. You were a vital service provider, a one-man industrial hub for an entire community. The lack of standardized currency, the fluctuating value of goods, and the ingrained social hierarchy all impacted how you conducted your business and, more importantly, how you survived. Payment for your services, as previously touched upon, was a constant negotiation and often a source of anxiety. While some transactions might involve the rare copper or silver coin, the more common form of payment was in kind. A portion of the farmer's harvest, a few eggs from the village wife, perhaps a measure of ale from the local brewer. This meant you had to be not just a blacksmith, but a shrewd estimator of value, constantly assessing whether 3 onions were truly a fair trade for sharpening a sickle, or if that promised half loaf of bread was worth the effort of mending a rusty pot. This system, while seemingly reciprocal, placed a significant burden on you. You had to trust that your customers would honor their promises, and you had to manage a constantly fluctuating inventory of received goods, hoping they wouldn't spoil before you could consume them or trade them for something else you needed. Patronage, too, played a significant role. The local lord or the wealthy monastery might be your most consistent, if demanding, customers. Their needs, for weapons armor repairs or intricate ironwork for their estates, were often larger and more complex, offering potentially greater rewards. However, these patrons also held immense power. They could dictate terms, demand urgency, and if displeased, could effectively cut off a significant source of your livelihood. You were bound by an unspoken fealty, a necessity to remain in their good graces, even if it meant working through the night on their demands, while more immediate village needs went unattended. Their coin, when it came, was often the lifeblood that kept your forge burning through leaner times. Your role was also tied into the seasonal rhythms of the village. During planting and harvesting seasons, the demand for your services would surge as farmers required their plowshares, scythes, and other agricultural tools to be in prime condition. This meant periods of intense, almost unbearable labor, often extending well into the night. In the quieter winter months, demand might slow, forcing you to focus on smaller domestic repairs, or perhaps to forge new, less urgent items in anticipation of future needs. This seasonal ebb and flow added another layer of unpredictability to your already precarious existence. Your ability to work with and shape metal was unique. You understood the temper of iron, the properties of different metals, the precise heats required to forge and quench a blade. This specialized knowledge gave you a certain inherent value, a silent power within the community. You were the only one who could provide these critical services, making you irreplaceable. Yet despite this indispensability, your social standing remained relatively modest. You were a skilled artisan, certainly, but you were still a commoner part of the working class. You were respected for your craft, but you were not celebrated in the same way as a knight or a wealthy merchant. Your wealth was not measured in land or titles, but in the tools you possessed, the skill in your hands, and the constant demand for your labor. The economic structure of the medieval village, with its localized needs, its barter system, and its clear social stratification, thus ensured that while you were essential, your life remained one of relentless toil, constant negotiation, and quiet, unacknowledged importance. Now let's consider another layer of the medieval experience that, while perhaps less about direct daily interaction with the blacksmith, profoundly shaped the world he inhabited and the demand for his craft, the various forms of entertainment, leisure, and daily customs that punctuated the otherwise arduous lives of medieval folk. Even in these moments of respite, the silent influence of the blacksmith's work was often present, providing the very tools and props for diversion. For the common villager, entertainment was a simple communal affair. There were village festivals, often tied to religious holidays or the changing agricultural seasons. These might involve wrestling matches where the strength of the local lads was pitted against one another, or perhaps rudimentary games involving sticks and stones. While you, the blacksmith, were likely too exhausted to participate actively, your presence was still felt. Perhaps the wrestling buckles on a belt or the iron tips on the staves used for mock combat bore your mark. The ale flowed freely drawn from barrels whose hoops and taps were your handiwork. The roasting spits turning over open fires at feasts were without a doubt forged by you. Even the simple wooden toys that children played with might have contained small iron nails or fittings that came from your forge. Music was another common form of entertainment. Traveling bards might pass through singing epic tales of knights and legendary heroes. While your hammer might never be the subject of a ballad, the very instruments they played, from the humble lute to the more complex hurdy-gurdy, often contained small, vital iron components, keys, strings, or fasteners, that only a blacksmith could provide. The village dancers, moving to the simple rhythms of pipe and drum, wore shoes that, if not directly made by you, certainly relied on the nails you forged. Storytelling, gathered around a crackling fire on a cold night, was a treasured pastime. As tales of brave knights and fearsome dragons unfolded, the flickering firelight would glint off the sturdy iron pot hanging over the flames, a pot you had likely painstakingly crafted, now simmering with the simple evening meal. The very fire irons used to tend the hearth, the hooks that held the cauldron, even the small decorative elements on a wooden chest where blankets were stored. These were the quiet, ubiquitous presence of your skill, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life. Even within the church, which provided both spiritual solace and communal gathering, your work was subtly essential. The heavy ornate crucifixes, the candle holders that lit the dim interiors, the sturdy iron gates that protected sacred relics, all required the blacksmith's touch. During religious processions, the banners and effigies might be mounted on poles with iron tips or carried on frames reinforced with your metalwork. Contrast this with the leisure activities of the nobility. For them, entertainment was often more elaborate and competitive. Hunting, a favored aristocratic pastime, required a constant supply of specialized equipment, finely wrought arrowheads, sturdy spear tips, and of course a constant supply of horseshoes for their mounts. Tournaments, those grand spectacles of chivalry and prowess, demanded vast quantities of armor and weaponry, a veritable gold mine of work for the blacksmith, as every dent, every broken chain link, every blunted edge needed repair or replacement. Even their games like chess might feature small, intricate iron pieces, or the tables on which they played might have decorative iron fittings. While the blacksmith rarely partook in these grand spectacles, he was the unseen architect behind them, providing the very means for their enjoyment. The fact that his products were used for leisure and pleasure, not just survival, was a testament to his essential role. Yet it was also another layer of ironic juxtaposition. He, whose life was one of unremitting toil, provided the very tools for others' carefree enjoyment, and perhaps received little more than a nod or a few meager coins in return for the implements that allowed them to forget the hardships he endured every single day. The quiet comfort of a warm home, the shared laughter around a fire, the thrill of a hunt. These moments of human connection and joy were in their own silent way also forged in your furnace. As we delve deeper into the layers of the blacksmith's indispensable yet often unacknowledged existence, it is worth exploring the broader historical context connecting your specific trade to related developments in other fields. The medieval period was a time of slow but significant innovation, and the blacksmith was not merely a craftsman repeating age-old techniques. He was often at the very forefront of practical technological advancement, influencing and being influenced by various aspects of daily life, from warfare to agriculture and even to the emerging sciences. Consider the evolution of warfare. The blacksmith's role was paramount. As infantry tactics evolved, so too did the demand for more sophisticated weaponry. You weren't just forging basic swords. You were constantly adapting, perfecting the balance of a blade, the temper of its edge, the strength of its hilt. The transition from simple mail armor to more complex plate armor, particularly from the 13th century onwards, created an entirely new domain of specialized work. Each plate, each rivet, each articulation of a suit of armor was a painstaking work of your hands, requiring precision and an understanding of how metal could deflect and absorb blows. Your skills directly influenced the survivability of knights and soldiers, playing a silent yet critical role on every battlefield. Without the blacksmith, the evolution of medieval warfare with its increasingly heavy and specialized equipment would have ground to a halt. In agriculture, your contribution was equally transformative. The heavy plow, a truly revolutionary invention that allowed for the cultivation of denser, wetter soils, relied entirely on robust iron components, coulters to cut the soil, plowshares to turn it, and mold boards to shape the furrow. These were complex, heavy pieces that needed constant maintenance and replacement. You were the one who enabled the increased agricultural output that supported larger populations, allowing villages to grow and flourish. Beyond the plow, every single iron tool used on the farm, from spades and hoes to axes and sickles, came from your forge. The efficiency of the harvest, the very ability of the community to feed itself, rested on the reliability and sharpness of the implements you created and maintained. Your tools were the foundation of their prosperity, directly impacting the quality and quantity of food on their tables. Even in architecture and daily construction, the blacksmith was an unseen architect. Castles, cathedrals, and even simpler village homes required vast quantities of ironwork. Nails, spikes, hinges for heavy doors, latches, bolts, and decorative iron grills were all products of your forge. The structural integrity and security of a building often depended on the quality of your fasteners. Imagine the massive wooden doors of a castle reinforced with intricate iron bands, or the heavy iron grates covering windows. These were not only functional, but often works of art, testament to your skill. Without your steady supply of these basic yet critical components, medieval construction would have been primitive indeed, relying on less durable methods. Furthermore, the blacksmith was often at the practical cutting edge of rudimentary engineering. The construction of watermills and windmills, vital for grinding grain and other industrial processes, relied on complex iron gearing axles and fittings that you and only you could fabricate. The precision and strength of these components were crucial for the efficiency and longevity of these early machines. You were in many ways the village engineer, problem solver, and innovator, constantly adapting your skills to meet new challenges and needs. The relationship between your craft and the broader economy extended to trade and transport. The iron fittings for wagons, carts, and river barges, the axles, wheels, and structural reinforcements ensured that goods could be moved efficiently from one place to another. Without reliable transportation, trade would have been severely hampered, limiting the economic reach and prosperity of any given region. Your work was the lubricant that allowed the wheels of commerce to turn. So while your life was a brutal symphony of heat and hammer, it was also one of profound, quiet influence. You were not just shaping metal, you were shaping the very infrastructure of medieval society, forging the tools that enabled progress in warfare, agriculture, construction, and trade. Your understanding of metal, born of intimate, painful experience, was a form of empirical science, a practical knowledge that underpinned countless other aspects of medieval life, making you an unsung vital link in the chain of historical development. To truly understand the multifaceted nature of the medieval blacksmith's contribution, it's beneficial to explore the myriad of specific items, both grand and mundane, that consistently flowed from your forge. These weren't just generic categories of tools or weapons. Each piece required specific knowledge, precision, and an often agonizing attention to detail, cementing your role as the indispensable backbone of medieval material culture. The sheer diversity of your output often goes unappreciated. Let's begin with the military necessities, as these were often the most urgent and, ironically, the most profitable. Beyond swords and daggers, which we've touched upon, you were responsible for crafting a vast array of specialized weaponry. Spearheads, their forms varying from broad leaf shapes for thrusting to narrow points for piercing mile. Axe heads, from battle axes designed for brutal impact to lighter throwing axes. Arrowheads produced in staggering numbers, each one needing to be meticulously shaped, weighted, and hafted for flight. You might even be called upon to produce specialized bolts for crossbows, requiring a different set of skills to ensure their trajectory and penetrative power. Then there was the constant repair and creation of shield bosses, the central iron dome on a shield that protected the hand and deflected blows. And of course, the ever-present need for armor repair, dented helmets, broken chainmail links, shattered plate sections. This wasn't merely mending. It was often a complex process of reheating, reshaping, and retempering a precise art to restore protection without compromising the metal's integrity. Moving into the realm of domestic and agricultural life, your forge was the source of countless everyday objects that allowed the village to function. Kitchen implements alone formed a significant category. You forged sturdy cauldrons and cooking pots designed to withstand direct flames for years. Trivets often with 3 legs to hold these pots over the fire. Ladles, skewers, and roasting spits, some quite elaborate for preparing meals. Imagine the daily use of these items constantly exposed to heat and grime. They were always in need of repair or replacement. Beyond the kitchen, you supplied hearth tools, tongs for managing embers, shovels for ash, and pokers for stirring the fire. For the farmer, the list was exhaustive. We've mentioned plowshares and sickles, but there were also scythes for harvesting hay, billhooks for clearing brush, and various types of hoes for cultivating the soil. Pitchforks, spades, and shovels, each requiring sturdy construction to withstand the immense forces applied during manual labor. The shoes for horses and oxen, each one unique to the animal's hoof, hammered from flat iron bar, a constant recurring demand that formed the bedrock of your income. Every animal used for draft power or transport needed regular shoeing, and a poorly shod animal meant a halt to vital work. Construction and household maintenance also fell squarely within your domain. Nails produced in a bewildering variety of sizes and shapes for everything from building houses to crafting furniture. Hinges from massive heavy-duty ones for castle gates to smaller, more delicate ones for cupboard doors. Latches and locks, simple yet crucial for security in a world without modern alarms. Hasps, staples, and brackets for holding things together or mounting objects. Even the simple chain that held the bucket over the village well, or the one used to tether an animal, was a product of your tireless effort. And then there were the more specialized, sometimes decorative items. Candlesticks, iron crosses for churches or graves, intricate grills for windows, and even rudimentary tools for other craftsmen, such as the adze for the carpenter or specialized awls for the cobbler. Every aspect of medieval life, from the most brutal act of war to the simplest domestic chore, relied on your hands, your fire, and your skill. You weren't just a blacksmith. You were the universal provider of metal, the craftsman whose quiet ingenuity and relentless labor manifested in every piece of shaped iron that made the medieval world possible. It's a profound testament to the quiet, ceaseless work that underpinned a civilization. Having explored the practical, tangible output of the medieval blacksmith, Let us now reflect on the profound cultural and daily life aspects that were intimately intertwined with your arduous profession. Beyond the specific tools and weapons, your trade and the very items it produced shaped the sensory landscape, the rituals, and even the superstitions of the medieval world in ways that often go unnoticed. Consider the sounds of the medieval village. While the clatter of carts, the lowing of cattle, and the murmur of human voices filled the air, the rhythmic clang of your hammer on the anvil was a constant, almost primal heartbeat. It was the sound of industry, of creation, of resilience. For villagers, this sound wasn't just noise. It was a reassuring presence, a signal that work was being done, that things were being made and mended, that the community was functioning. It might have lulled some to sleep in the evenings, a comforting reminder of the world's steady turn, or stirred others to begin their own day as the first strikes echoed in the pre-dawn dark. The visual landscape, too, bore your mark. The smoke rising from your forge was a common sight, a visible plume signaling your industrious presence. The gleam of newly polished tools hanging outside your workshop, the sturdy iron bands reinforcing a cart, the heavy dark hinges on every door. These were ubiquitous elements of the visual environment, a constant, unspoken testament to your labor. Your own figure, perpetually soot-stained and muscular, was an archetype instantly recognizable within the village. Superstitions often swirled around the blacksmith. The transformative power of fire, the mysterious nature of metal, and your ability to bring it to life and shape it into useful or dangerous forms imbued your trade with an almost magical aura. Horseshoes forged by your hand were believed to ward off evil when nailed above a door. The ringing of your anvil was thought to drive away malicious spirits. People might seek out iron charms from you, believing they offered protection from various ills or brought good fortune. You might be asked to fashion small amulets, or to work with certain metals thought to have specific properties, blending practical craft with folk belief. Though you might scoff at such notions in your private moments, you understood the deep-seated human need for protection and comfort, and you provided it through the very material you mastered. The blacksmith's forge was also a hub for gossip and news, albeit a smoky one. While you were isolated in your work, villagers constantly passed through your workshop, bringing not just their broken items, but also the latest news, the whispers of the market, the rumors from the Lord's manor. You might not actively participate in the conversations, your focus on the glowing metal, but you were an unwitting repository of information, absorbing the fabric of village life through the snippets you overheard. Your specific skill also influenced the broader cultural perception of strength and resilience. To be strong as an ox was one thing, but to be strong as a blacksmith carried its own unique weight, suggesting not just physical power, but an unyielding, almost elemental toughness, a resistance to the very forces that shaped you. The very word forge itself came to signify creation, shaping, and enduring hardship, concepts directly derived from your daily reality. In essence, the medieval blacksmith wasn't just an economic necessity. You were a vital part of the medieval sensorium, an anchor in the community's daily rhythm, and a quiet, unassuming contributor to its cultural fabric and superstitions. Your life, though brutal, was one that actively shaped the practical, visual, auditory, and even mystical experiences of everyone around you, ensuring that the very essence of your trade resonated far beyond the confines of your smoky workshop. Now let us reflect on the more nuanced internal aspects of the blacksmith's psychological landscape. How the relentless demands of the forge, the constant physical agony, and the pervasive sensory environment shaped not just the body, but the mind and the very temperament of the man. This wasn't merely a physical occupation. It was a deeply immersive psychological experience that forged a particular kind of individual. The sheer repetitive nature of the work, the endless cycle of striking, heating, and quenching, instilled a profound sense of rhythm and precision. Your movements became economical, almost meditative. Each hammer blow was not just an act of brute force, but a part of a larger choreographed dance with the metal. This repetitive motion, coupled with the intense focus required to work with glowing iron, could induce a kind of trance-like state, a mental absorption that paradoxically might have offered a strange form of escape from the surrounding discomfort. You were entirely present in the moment, focused solely on the task at hand, which could be a subtle form of mental resilience against the daily grind. However, this constant absorption also bred a formidable stubbornness. You were, after all, constantly battling against an unyielding material, forcing it to conform to your will. This daily struggle against iron translated into a deep-seated resistance to external pressures and a fierce independence of spirit. You became a person who understood intimately that things worth having, shapes worth achieving, required persistent effort and an absolute refusal to quit. This made you difficult to intimidate, perhaps even a bit terse in your interactions. Your words, like your hammer blows, were direct and to the point, unadorned by unnecessary pleasantries. The constant exposure to danger, the searing heat, the flying sparks, the risk of crushing blows, instilled a heightened sense of awareness and a grim acceptance of risk. You learned to read the subtle signs of overheating metal, to anticipate the unpredictable flicker of a spark. This constant vigilance, while exhausting, also honed your instincts and your ability to react quickly. It bred a pragmatism that scoffed at frivolity. Every action had a consequence, every mistake could be costly. Socially, the blacksmith often developed a quiet detachment. Your forge was your world, and while villagers came and went, their concerns were often fleeting compared to the fundamental elemental battles you waged daily. You heard their gossip, their complaints, their petty squabbles, but they often seemed distant, almost trivial against the backdrop of shaping the very tools they relied upon. This detachment, however, did not imply indifference. Rather, it was a coping mechanism, a way to maintain focus amidst the clamor of external demands. You cared deeply about the quality of your work, because the effectiveness of a farmer's plow or a knight's sword directly impacted their lives, and by extension, the stability of the entire community. There was also a deep, if unarticulated, pride that came from your unique skill. In a world where most people were bound to the land or to simple crafts, you commanded an almost alchemical knowledge. You could transform inert ore into tools of power and utility. This mastery, achieved through years of painful experience, gave you a quiet confidence, a sense of self-worth that transcended your modest social standing. You knew what you were capable of, and that knowledge was a powerful internal validation. Yet this internal strength was often accompanied by a profound weariness. The cumulative mental toll of constant problem-solving, the pressure to meet deadlines, the financial anxieties, and the sheer physical exhaustion meant that true mental rest was rare. Your mind, like your muscles, was perpetually engaged, even in sleep, replaying the day's challenges. This psychological hardening, a resilience forged in the fires of necessity, defined the medieval blacksmith as much as his physical prowess. He was a man of few words, perhaps, but his character was etched as deeply as the marks on his anvil, shaped by the relentless, demanding, and ultimately fulfilling rhythm of his brutal craft. The blacksmith's life was also profoundly shaped by the seasons, a cyclical influence that dictated both the nature and the intensity of his work. While the forge burned year-round, the specific demands of each season brought unique challenges and rhythms, further defining the relentless, never-ending nature of the trade. In the depths of winter, the forge became a dual necessity and a brutal master. The external cold, often biting and penetrating, made the workshop a comparatively warm haven, drawing people in. However, this warmth was concentrated around the hearth. The outer edges of the forge would still be drafty, a polite couple of degrees above freezing, ensuring that while your front was roasting, your back was often numb with cold. The extreme temperatures meant that metal once removed from the fire cooled even more rapidly, demanding quicker, more precise hammer blows. This was a time for repairing tools that had broken during the autumn harvest or being prepared for spring planting. Farmers would bring in worn plowshares, axes, and shovels, anticipating the thaw. It was also a period for crafting more intricate household items, as travel was difficult and larger, less urgent projects could be undertaken. The sheer physical effort required to keep warm while working, battling both the internal heat of the forge and the external cold, added another layer of exhaustion. Spring, with its promise of new growth, brought a surge of agricultural demands. As the fields thawed and preparations for planting began, the need for fully functional farming tools became paramount. You'd be inundated with requests for sharpening sickles, repairing hoes, mending broken cartwheels that had suffered through the winter. This was a period of intense, often rushed work, as every day lost to a broken tool meant a delay in planting, which in turn could threaten the entire harvest. The air would be filled with the scent of damp earth mingling with your smoke, and the pressure of the planting season would hang heavy in the air, a silent, urgent demand. Summer, while perhaps offering slightly more forgiving external temperatures, brought its own distinct set of pressures. As the crops ripened, the demand shifted towards harvesting tools, scythes for the grain, axes for timber. The long daylight hours meant that work could extend even further into the evenings, pushing your already exhausted body to its absolute limits. Horses would be heavily worked in the fields, necessitating frequent shoeing. The heat from the forge, combined with the natural summer warmth, turned your workshop into a veritable oven, and the ever-present thirst was a constant companion. This was also a time when lords might embark on campaigns or hunts, creating sudden urgent demands for military equipment, pulling you away from agricultural work and adding another layer of unpredictable chaos to your schedule. Autumn. The season of harvest and preparation for winter brought another peak in demand. The intense work of gathering crops meant tools were pushed to their breaking point, requiring constant repair. This was also the season for slaughtering animals and preserving food, necessitating various iron implements for butchering and preparing goods for storage. As the days shortened, the forge's warmth once again became a welcome, if smoky, refuge from the encroaching chill. It was a time of frenetic activity, ensuring everything was ready before the harsh grip of winter descended. This cyclical pattern of demand meant there was rarely, if ever, a true lull. Your work was directly tied to the very survival of the community, and that survival was inexorably linked to the rhythms of nature. You were not just a craftsman. You were an integral part of the medieval ecosystem, your efforts directly influencing the success or failure of the harvest, the security of homes, and the readiness for war. The seasons dictated your pace, your priorities, and added another layer to the quiet, ceaseless endurance that defined the brutal and indispensable life of the medieval blacksmith. Finally, let us consider the blacksmith's influence on the broader concepts of durability and longevity within the medieval world, an aspect of his work that quietly defied the transient nature of many other crafts. In a time when most materials, wood, leather, cloth, were susceptible to decay, wear, and the ravages of time, the iron objects you forged held a remarkable promise of permanence. This inherent longevity of your creations meant that while your own life was short and arduous, your legacy endured in a way few others could claim. Think about the lifespan of the items you created compared to other medieval necessities. A peasant's wooden cart might last a decade or two, constantly needing repairs to its frame. A farmer's leather shoes would wear out within a year, perhaps two, requiring frequent replacement. Clothing spun from wool or flax would fray and tear, eventually repurposed into rags. Even the very structures of homes, largely timber-framed, required constant maintenance against rot and insect infestation. But your ironwork, once forged and properly cooled, held an astonishing resilience. A well-made iron hinge, though it might rust and seize without proper care, could theoretically last for centuries, outliving generations of villagers and even the very buildings it adorned. The plowshare you hammered, while it might dull and chip with years of biting into stubborn earth, could be repeatedly brought back to your forge, reheated, reshaped, and returned to service, essentially reborn through fire. A sword, though perhaps bent or broken in battle, could be reforged, its very material carrying the history of its previous life into a new functional form. This circularity of material, the ability to recycle and renew, was a quiet testament to the enduring power of metal and your mastery over it. This inherent durability meant that your impact was cumulative. Over decades, perhaps centuries, the physical landscape of the village would become subtly saturated with your work. The sturdy gate to the churchyard, the complex lock on the Lord's granary, the iron bands around the community well, these became fixtures, part of the unchanging backdrop of life. They were silent witnesses to the generations that passed, testaments to your unseen hand. They required maintenance, yes, but their fundamental form, their very existence, spoke of a permanence that other materials simply couldn't offer. This also meant that your creations possessed a unique kind of memory. Each tool, each implement carried the faint, indelible marks of your hammer, the specific temper you gave it, the unique curve of your tongs. A farmer might recognize the work of Old Master Thomas in the familiar feel of his plowshare, even after it had been repaired by your father and then by you. The objects themselves held stories not of grand battles, but of countless hours of labor of the land, being turned of meals, being cooked of doors, swinging open and closed. The blacksmith was therefore an unwitting contributor to the long-term material stability of medieval society. You provided the parts that held the world together physically over extended periods, while the ephemeral aspects of life, the crops, the cloth, the fleeting entertainments, came and went with the seasons. Your iron creations stood as silent, enduring monuments to human ingenuity and tireless effort. You forged items that were not merely functional for a single use or a single lifetime, but were designed by their very nature to persist, to defy decay, to bear witness to the passage of time. And in this quiet, unseen way, the brutal and indispensable life of the medieval blacksmith contributed to the very foundations of civilization, one durable, lasting piece of iron at a time. And so, as the last echoes of the hammer fades, and the lingering scent of smoke in your imagination gently dissipates, we drift away from the harsh, vital world of the medieval blacksmith. His was a life of unremitting toil, a constant dance with fire and steel marked by calloused hands and weary bones. Yet in his quiet, essential work, he shaped the very foundations of his world, forging not just tools and weapons, but the durable fabric of a society that depended utterly on his skill. Now, as you lie in the quiet comfort of your own space, perhaps reflect on the vast distance between that ancient, smoke-filled forge and the gentle ease of your present moment. No bitter chill penetrating thin walls, no aching muscles from a day wrestling with raw iron, no constant sting of soot in your lungs. The quiet hum of your modern world, the soft warmth of your bed, the simple promise of an unbroken night's rest, these are comforts the medieval blacksmith rarely knew. Let the imagery of the forge, The rhythmic clang and the glowing embers softly recede now. Allow your mind to clear to release the last vestiges of historical thought. The work is done, the story told. There is only peace here, a tranquil stillness that invites deep restorative sleep. As you settle deeper, know that the long journey of history, with all its struggles and triumphs, has brought you to this very moment of quiet repose. Let your breath deepen, your muscles relax, and your thoughts grow soft and distant. May your dreams be gentle and your rest profound. Sweet dreams.